This is Jim Ransom, back again to read some poetry. Last weekend was a holiday, as well as the grim beginning of another war in the Middle East. I was not in the mood to read poetry, to be frank with you, and you may not have wanted to hear any, but today we are back at it. The poets we are reading are the early 19th century American poets, including Longfellow, Poe, Emily Dickinson, and of course Walt Whitman. These are poets who first gave American poetry a name for itself, and there are others as well, but I couldn't read a sample of them all. None of them are very popular outside of required English classes for English majors. Part of this is that, except for Emily Dickinson, they wrote huge, long poems. In the age of TV and the internet, who has time for them? But they were ideal for the age in which they were written. So here we go. The first poem I'm going to read is My Lost Youth by Henry W. Longfellow. Let's find it here. And here it is. Often I think of the beautiful town that is seated by the sea. Often in thought go up and down the pleasant streets of that dear old town, and my youth comes back to me. And a verse of a Lapland song is haunting my memory still. A boy's will is the wind's will, and the thoughts of youth are long, long thoughts. I can see the shadowy lines of its trees and catch in sudden gleams the sheen of the far surrounding seas and islands that were the Hesperides of all my boyish dreams. And the burden of that old song, it murmurs and whispers still. A boy's will is the wind's will, and the thoughts of youth are long, long thoughts. I remember the gleams and glooms that dart across the schoolboy's brain, the song and the silence in the heart, that in part are prophecies and in part are longings wild and vain. And the voice of that fitful song sings on and is never still. A boy's will is the wind's will, and the thoughts of youth are long, long thoughts. These are things of which I may not speak. There are dreams that cannot die. There are thoughts that make the strong heart weak and bring a pallor into the cheek and a mist before the eye. And the words of that fatal song come over me like a chill. A boy's will is the wind's will, and the thoughts of youth are long, long thoughts. That was typical Longfellow. He had a master's knowledge of how to craft a stanza and how to create a rhyme. And I picked this one because it was shorter than most of his poems, but even so, I had to cut out most of it. Still, it gives you a good sense of how he wrote and contains the memorable line that I can still remember from my childhood. A boy's will is the wind's will. Well, now we're going to move on to Edgar Allan Poe. Poe was the master of the mysterious voice in storytelling and poetry. He was a master of what you might call scary stories. And in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, he was sort of kicked out of the pantheon of American poets to some extent by the critics of the time, who thought that his stuff was just too artificial and not in keeping with what they thought would be good poetry. But then he had a resurrection, and we had a lot of poems by Poe that appeared back in the books of poetry, like the one I'm reading from today, like Annabel Lee and The City and the Sea, The Valley of Unrest, and so on. But here's one that's fairly short and to the point. It's called To Helen. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore that gently o'er a perfumed sea the weary, wayworn wanderer bore to his own native shore. On desperate seas long wont to roam thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face. Thy naiad airs have brought me home to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. Lo, in yon brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand. Ah, Psyche, from the regions which are the Holy Land. Well, we start out thinking that maybe he's writing this poem about a lover of his named Helen, but no. This is about Helen from Homerian Greece, the Helen that stands out in Greek legend. So he was writing about something from the distant past. I thought about reading The Raven or parts of Annabel Lee. Those are very interesting poems, to say the least, but I just couldn't take the time that they required. And I didn't think they were really quite that good as poetry either. So I think we have to let Poe go and say that he was unique among American poets for his love of mystery and frightening images. Now here's one from Walt Whitman that's called Starting from Pomenoc. In other words, he never gave titles to his poems. We always had to use the first line or some words from the first line. And so this is from a poem called Starting from Pomenoc. Starting from fish-shaped Pomenoc, where I was born, well begotten and raised by a perfect mother, after roaming many lands, lover of populous pavements, dweller in Manhattan, my city, or on southern savannas, or a soldier camped, or carrying my knapsack and gun, or a miner in California, or rude in my home in Dakota's woods, my diet meat, my drink from the spring. Or withdrawn to muse and meditate in some deep recess, far from the clank of crowds and intervals, passing rapt and happy, aware of the fresh free giver, the flowing Missouri, aware of mighty Niagara, aware of the buffalo herds grazing the plains, the hirsute and strong-breasted bull, of earth, rocks, fifth month flowers experienced, stars, rain, snow, my amaze, having studied the mockingbird's tones and the flight of the mountain hawk, and heard at dawn the unrivaled one, the hermit thrush, from the swamp cedars. Solitary singing in the west, I strike up for a new world. Well, that's very typical of Walt Whitman. And here's a little bit more from Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents born here, from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death. And it goes on like that for page after page after page. Song of Myself. Walt Whitman was a traveler over most of America. I'm not aware of any short poems. I had to severely edit what I did read to give you a sense of Whitman's style and manner of writing. And there you have it. Now we're going to jump to another very important 19th century poet. And who might that be? Emily Dickinson, of course. And her story is one of the strangest in the poetic lexicon. Let's start by reading you from some of her poetry. Let's read a short one here. It's called I'm Wife. I'm wife. I've finished that other state. I'm czar. I'm woman now. It's safer so. How odd the girl's life looks behind this soft eclipse. I think that earth seems so to those in heaven now. This being comfort then, that other kind was pain. But why compare? I'm wife. Stop there. Well, she wasn't anybody's wife. But let's read this other one. This one's called This Quiet Dust. This quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies and lads and girls, was laughter and ability and sighing and frocks and curls. This passive place, a summer's nimble mansion, where bloom and bees fulfill their oriental circuit, then seized like these. That's a very deep poem. This quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies and lads and girls. Well, what can we say about Emily Dickinson? Her poetry was very different from most of her contemporaries, and as far as she was concerned, the poems were written for her. She never sought publication, or at least not in a very serious way. And she died at the age of 56, and during her last illness, she told her sister Lavinia to burn her poems, burn up her poems. Well, she gave Lavinia just a small number of poems, and Lavinia thought that was it. And I may just honor her wishes. But Lavinia started searching around the house, and she came across a trove of poems. There were 1,800 of them, and she wasn't about to throw those away, so she asked a friend whose name was Mabel Loomis Todd to edit and publish them. This lady was very vivacious and person who was very, very interested in poetry, not a writer of poetry herself, but she was perfectly willing to take on this job, and maybe less so once she realized what it was going to be like. Dickinson never gave titles to her poems. The first lines became the titles for the most part. And her handwriting was obscure. It was a mixture of print and text. And her creation of capitals was odd. It was actually hard to read her poems. And so it took Mabel Todd quite a while to make them out, and then she copied them over in her own very fine longhand. And towards the end of the time, she actually mastered a Hammond typewriter and was able to type some of the poems. And then she developed a partnership with a retired literature-loving Civil War major or colonel, I can't remember exactly which, and the two of them were able to put together these poems in a publishable form, although they bickered a lot about titles and about the wording and where the capital letters should go, and on, stuff like that. So Mabel Loomis Todd had a daughter, and the daughter also helped her a lot. This took several years. And so getting Emily Dickinson's poem to press was a major undertaking by 3 different people. It was something else. And the thing was complicated a little bit by the fact that Emily Dickinson's older brother had a rather a lusty affair with Mabel Loomis Todd before the poetry offer actually came. And the affair was over by that time, but we don't really know what effect that might have had on Mabel Loomis Todd's willingness to get into the poetry of Emily. So you can see there's a lot of ins and outs in the Dickinson biography. And there's been a lot written about Emily Dickinson. I think we all have to look it up and see what it was all about to get a picture that suits our image of Emily Dickinson. But she certainly was a marvelous and unique and individual poet. She was not like anybody else in her era, and it's very good that we have her to look at today. And it's very lucky when you consider that all of her poems might have been burned up if Mabel Loomis Todd hadn't understood that they needed to be published. Okay, that's it for today, and thanks for tuning in.